Good afternoon. I am Linda Espinosa, Director of Media for the Silsila Dialogue Movement. This presentation is on how to face divisions inside Christianity and Islam and how their spiritual approaches can bring harmony among us. This presentation is also one of the central parts of the Silsila School of Mercy. It will be divided into 4 parts. Part 1 refers to the reality of division in Christianity and Islam. Part 2 refers to the spirituality beyond divisions, and this is going to be divided into 3 topics. The first topic is, what is spirituality? The second topic is spirituality in Christianity, and the third is spirituality in Islam. Part 3 refers to the converging points of Christian and Islamic spirituality. Part 4 refers to the spirituality and harmony prayer as a vision and style of life to live a common spirituality towards dialogue and peace. What are the reality of divisions in Christianity? At the Last Supper, Jesus prayed that we may be one. He must have anticipated divisions, and so there have been from the very beginning. Once Christianity was accepted in the Roman Empire, councils could be called, doctrines defined, and mainland Christianity established. Those who disagreed with these councils were simply cast out as heretics, and though these communities remained active, they eventually were pushed to the edges and their scriptures burned. Tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity go back to the early centuries of the Church. Soon after the Roman Emperor Constantine accepted Christianity, he moved the center of the empire to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, and called councils to be held in Turkey. This set up 2 competing centers of Christianity, one in Rome where the Pope resided, and one in Constantinople where the Emperor resided. The most tragic and momentous division in the Church was caused by the Protestant Reformation, which began in the 16th century. There were many factors in the period before the Reformation that led to this historic upheaval and division in Christianity. There were early revolts against the wealth and power of the popes, the church hierarchy, and even some of the clergy. This came from the people who wanted to return to the example of Jesus and the Gospels. Another major factor leading up to the Reformation was the spread of the Black Death, a quickly fatal disease that killed off 1/3 of Europe's population, beginning in 1348 and flaring up again every 10 years after that. Many in the convents and monasteries died, leaving those places open to marauders who attacked the monks, raped the nuns, and laid these institutions to waste. Many of the clergy who served the sick and dying were themselves killed by the disease, and to replace them, the church had to lower standards. The plague also produced a preoccupation with death in the European culture, a fear of hell and purgatory, and an interest in superstition. Many, especially those selling indulgences, preyed on these fears. The Second Vatican Council made major breakthroughs on ecumenism. It shifted the focus to the common ground shared by the Catholics and their separated brethren: belief in Jesus Christ, the Scriptures, the life of grace, the virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and the gifts of the Spirit. It acknowledged that all baptized people are members of Christ's body, all brothers and sisters in the Lord, and that the truth and salvation can be found in these separated communities, also now referred to as churches. It also declared that the liturgical actions of these communities can engender grace and give access to salvation. The Council acknowledged that not all truths of the faith exist on the same level, but rather there is a hierarchy of beliefs. This left some of the traditions more open to debate and reinterpretation. The Church now committed itself to an active role in ecumenism and encouraged respectful dialogue as well as a mutual worship, prayer, and cooperation. In spite of the new spirit of Vatican II dialogue in the Catholic Church, divisions inside and outside the Church are still visible. Spirituality beyond division. What is spirituality? For sure, Christianity and Islam have many rich experiences of spirituality which help us to understand better how God is working in these two religions. But the challenge that we pose here is to understand that also in other religions and even outside the formal traditional religions like indigenous religions, there are other forms of spirituality. This helps us to explore more the spiritual dimension of life and the mystery of life, helping us to go beyond the limits of our understanding and discover more the aspirations of each person. It brings us to the richness of each person as a creature of God who needs to love and be loved. It is a need like that of a breath of air to continue to live. In fact, the root word of spirituality is spirare, to breathe. But this word is related to life, for it is through breathing that a human being can stay alive. This is a manifestation of God and His love that is always alive. There was a time in history when the term spirituality or spiritual was understood in a negative way. Today, there is a great attention to spirituality because it is part of life, and we can discover forms of spirituality also among those who claim that they do not have any religion, but their spiritual aspirations manifested in their search for meaning in life and in their commitment for the common good and their respect for humanity and ethics that help them to listen to the voice of conscience. Thus, we can say that there are many forms of spirituality inside and outside religions. Our faith generates the dynamic energy of the Spirit and the need to live what we believe. Many are not able to experience the richness of spirituality because they are not pure in heart and believe that they are too busy to listen to God's presence. Entering the spirit of self-transcendence must be part of our life. In our search for more, Jesus advises us to become simple as children, telling us clearly, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God." We find in all religions those who search for more and reach high levels of spirituality starting from what they believe. One example is the experience of Al-Ghazali, a famous and respected Muslim scholar and Sufi of the past who died in the year 1111, who understood well the need of the Spirit, and he went beyond the teachings and rituals of his faith to experience God's love more and the need to have a taste of God. For this reason, he started to give more attention to the deepening in this experience. He was a famous scholar, but in his searching for more, he felt a stronger need to have a taste of God. We wish also to help people to understand that different forms of spirituality are becoming more global and visible in the world today, helping humanity to rediscover not only the spirituality of different religions, but also the spiritual wisdom of the human race in its historical unfolding. The term spirituality is emerging also in areas where traditionally it has been ignored and banned. For example, it is emerging in the world of business and other fields of society, including ecology and dialogue with creation. This adventure of life helps us to rediscover not only the presence of different forms of spirituality in the world, but also their contribution for harmony and peace. This challenges to develop in us a great respect and appreciation for the spirituality of others, and at the same time inspire us to deepen the spirituality in our own religions. Considering that this presentation is addressed more to Christians and Muslims, we are invited to know more about the spirituality of Christianity and Islam in the context of our traditions, with the desire to understand the richness of other forms of spirituality in the world. Spirituality in Christianity. We start to give definition of mysticism as the immediate knowledge of God attained in this life through personal religious experience. It is a state of prayer which includes both brief moments of divine touch as well as a permanent union with God, which some spiritual writers call the mystical marriage. The mystics agree that the proof of a genuine mystical experience is shown in an increase of virtue. For example, love, humility, service. Dreams, visions, locutions, trances, visions, and ecstasies may accompany Christian mystical experience, but they are not essential to it. Some mystics hold that such extraordinary phenomena usually cease at the higher states of mystical experience. However, most Christians would agree that some mystical elements are part of the life of every true Christian. The Catholic and Orthodox churches highly revere their mystics. Many of the great mystics are considered saints, and their writings are studied and followed. Their lives are considered models to be imitated. Protestants, while more reserved in their attitude towards the mystical tradition, are not without mystics of their own. Christians often speak of spiritualities, comprehensive ways or programs of Christian life which usually include mystical elements. Each Christian spiritual tradition has for its goal the perfect following of all that is taught in the Gospels, and is thus called an evangelical path. One might say that spirituality is a program for conforming oneself internally to the implications of following Jesus in each aspect of life. In this sense, there is only one Christian spirituality, that is, responding fully to all that God has taught in the Bible. Christian spirituality is an awareness that a response to God necessarily includes a vertical and a horizontal dimension, neither of which may be lacking in a fully integrated Christian life. The vertical dimension is that of worship and prayer, the Christian's duties before God. The horizontal dimension includes the Christian's responsibilities towards oneself, towards others, and towards society, in which love and service are to be the motivating and unifying factors. Jesus taught that the whole teaching of the law and the prophets can be summarized in 2 commandments. The first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. The second, which is similar, is to love your neighbor as yourself. This law of love is so central that St. Paul says a person can understand all the mysteries of theology, do great deeds, and even die a martyr for his faith. But if he does not perform those deeds in love, it is all useless. Although there is fundamentally only one Christian spirituality to which Orthodox, Catholics, and Protestants aspire, Christian history knows various movements or programs of spirituality which emphasize certain elements of the biblical message or provide a distinct method for following the gospel. Although it is not possible to give here a complete history of Christian spiritual traditions and mystical writers, I will try to outline some of the most important and representative movements. We present now some of the important spiritual movements of Christian traditions. First is early monasticism. Already in the days of the apostles, there were some Christians who chose to follow Christ in virginity and asceticism. Jesus never married, and he taught that there were those who would remain virgins for the sake of God's reign. However, most of his disciples, including Peter, were married men, Paul being one of the exceptions. At first, virginity was associated with the belief in Jesus' imminent return and the coming of the last day. Eventually, when it became clear that the second coming of Jesus was not to happen immediately, some Christians chose virginity as a sign of the new life to be found in Christ and the new relationships within the Christian community based not on bloodlines and family bonds, but on the faith in God. The second is hesychasm. Hesychasm is a Greek word meaning quietness, and it indicates the main current of mystical practice in Orthodox Christianity. This method began in the 4th to 5th century among monks in what is today Turkey and Greece. The hesychasts practice a type of repetitive prayer similar to the dhikr of Sufi Muslims called the Jesus prayer. This short prayer is repeated continuously with a particular body posture, eyes fixed inwardly on the heart, and controlled breathing. The goal is a non-conceptual prayer of the heart where the person awaits the divine light. The third is the mystical mystics in the West. The mystics in the West, like the hesychasts in the East, were greatly influenced by Dionysius. Dionysius held that the goal of human life is an intimate union between the believer and God, which leads to the progressive deification of men.
I find it interesting that roots of the monastic movement, the Christian monastic movement, can actually be found back in ancient Judaism, even before Jesus. The Pharisees, whom we all know from the Gospels, are very much, in many ways, very much like the religious orders in the Catholic Church. And we had the Essenes, who had their community at the Dead Sea, who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a very monastic character. And these groups are seeking God in a certain way. But the Christian monastic movement, I would say we also see roots for that in the Scriptures, where Christians are supposed to fast and seek God and seek peace and pray. Pray always, St. Paul says and Jesus says, and that's what monks are supposed to do too. But the formal monastic movement in Christianity really took off in the 4th century. There was, at that time, an openness to Christianity then in the Roman Empire, which had previously been an illegal religion and suffered persecutions. But it eventually became a socially right thing to do. Everybody's becoming Christian, and so the moral life of Christians became lax, and the purists among them, the diehards, wanted something more rigorous. So the monastic life, where you go out into the desert and live simply and really seek purity, became a strong movement, particularly in Egypt. And Egypt became the place of repute for the strongest monks. And that's where John Cassian relearned monasticism and brought it to the West. And St. Benedict then refers to John Cassian's institutes and conferences and his rule. And of course, St. Benedict's rule became predominant in the West during the Middle Ages and has been so ever since.
So the origins of monasticism are there. It's too complex to go into the whole thing, but St. Benedict when he comes along, we think of him as the origin of monasticism, but monasticism has been several centuries in the making. When he comes along and draws from many traditions and forms a way of life for monks to live together. He represents a sort of, he didn't intend to do this, I don't think, but it turns out to be a sort of ingenious synthesis of the previous centuries. And as such, then, it becomes, for subsequent centuries in Western Europe, it becomes the premier form of monasticism, just because he got so much wisdom in his rule, which reaches back to those early centuries of monasticism, but focused it for the new situation in which he found himself in his day. In the centuries following St. Benedict, and especially from the 9th century on, Benedictine monasteries began to be established throughout Europe, and were, as I said earlier, were considered a blessing virtually everywhere they showed up.
The fourth is Francis of Assisi. Francis is one of the more beloved and influential persons in Christian history. Born into a wealthy merchant family in the town of Assisi, Francis experienced dissatisfaction with his worldly way of life and devoted the rest of his years to following the example of Jesus. At the age of 20, with a group of equally young companions, he began to live in a literal way Jesus called to follow him in poverty. This life of absolute evangelical poverty was a great challenge to the Church of Francis' day, which was extremely wealthy. Francis was certainly a mystic, and he would retire for weeks and months at a time to caves and woods to pray. He was blessed with visions and extraordinary religious experiences. Near the end of his life, he is said to have received the stigmata, the marks of Jesus' wounds on his body. However, Francis' path to God was the exact opposite of the Dionysian mystics. Instead of extinguishing the senses, Francis taught that the created world was the immediate sign of God's gracious activity towards men. He called the sun brother and the moon sister, and he saw all animals, plants, and natural phenomena as fellow creatures of God. The way of life which he inspired was one of simplicity, quiet piety, disinterest in intellectual achievement of worldly ambition, and an affectionate and familial relationship to the created universe.
Saint Francis is one of the world's most popular and beloved saints. He is the patron of animals, merchants, and ecology. Francis was born in Assisi, Italy in 1181 to wealthy parents. His father was a silk merchant who nicknamed his son Francis after France, a nation and culture which he admired. Francis enjoyed a comfortable youth and had many friends. He himself said that he lived in sin during his teenage years. As a young man, Francis thirsted for glory. While setting out to join the Fourth Crusade, God spoke to Francis and told him to return home. Francis was humiliated, but he obeyed. Later, when he encountered a leper, Francis was moved with compassion and he gave the man a kiss as a sign of peace. Afterwards, the man vanished. Francis concluded God had been testing him. The final moment of conversion came when Francis visited a dilapidated church, and he heard God ask him to rebuild the church. Francis assumed God wanted him to rebuild the church he was praying in, so he stole money and cloth from his father to do it. Enraged, Francis's father took his son to the bishop and sued him for the money. The bishop ordered Francis to repay it, and Francis responded by renouncing his inheritance and his family and dedicating his life to serving the poor. Francis took to the streets and lived day to day, relying on God to provide. As he went about, he cared for the sick and the poor. Francis became legendary for his compassion. It said he could talk to the animals. Followers flocked to Francis, and he established an order of monks. Today it is the Franciscan order. Francis lived a life so holy he was canonized just 2 years after his death. Today, St. Francis intercedes on behalf of faithful Catholics around the world, and a great number of miracles are attributed to his name.
The fifth movement, the Spanish mystics. A high point of Christian mysticism was reached in Spain in the 16th century in the works of John of the Cross, who died in 1591, Teressa of Avila, who died in 1582, and Ignatius of Loyola, who died in 1556. All three of these persons lived extremely active lives and were deeply involved in reform movements within the Catholic Church. But their mystical writings are among the most important in the Christian tradition.
Born Inigo Lopez de la Hoya in 1491, the man known as Ignatius of Loyola was the youngest of 13 children. Despite the misfortune of losing his mother at a young age, he was still a member of the local aristocracy and was raised accordingly. He became ambitious as a youth and wanted to be a great general. By the time he was 18, he had become a soldier. He began referring to himself as Ignatius, a more mature version of his name. He gained a reputation as a duelist. According to one story, he killed a Moor with whom he argued about the divinity of Christ. His skill in combat earned him promotions, and soon he commanded his own troops. In 1521, Ignatius was struck by a cannonball in the legs. To save his life, and possibly his legs, doctors performed several surgeries. After suffering for a month, his doctors warned him to prepare for death. But instead of dying, Ignatius began to improve. During this time, Ignatius began to read about the lives of the saints and Christ. The stories had a profound impact on him. As he lay bedridden, Ignatius developed a desire to become a working servant of Christ. He especially wanted to convert non-Christians. In 1522, he gave his clothes away to a poor man and began a period of work, prayer, and contemplation. Following a short pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Ignatius realized he needed a complete education to convert people. He attended a grammar school for children to learn Latin and other basic subjects. He then traveled to various universities to learn more. Ignatius often engaged others in lengthy conversations about spiritual matters. The Inquisition accused Ignatius of preaching without any formal education in theology. He was questioned 3 times, but his heart was pure, and he was always exonerated. Ignatius decided he needed more education. He was 38 years old when he entered the University of Paris. He earned a master's degree at the age of 44. While at school, Ignatius roomed with Peter Faber and Francis Xavier. The men became friends, and Ignatius led them in spiritual exercises. Other men soon joined their exercises and became followers of Ignatius. The group began to refer to themselves as Friends in the Lord. In 1539, the group went to Rome and presented themselves to the Pope. Pope Paul III approved them as an order in 1540. Ignatius became their first leader. He imposed a strict, almost military rule on his order. Despite the strict rules, the order grew. The order was responsible for much of the work of stopping the spread of the Protestant Reformation. Today, his order is known as the Society of Jesus, and it works in educating the youth around the world. Several universities have been founded in the name of Ignatius and in the traditional Jesuit spirit. Ignatius passed away on July 31st, 1556, at the age of 64. He was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1609 and canonized in 1622 by Gregory XV. His feast day is celebrated on July 31st, and he is the patron saint of the Society of Jesus, soldiers, and educators.
At the beginning of his great work, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas stated, "We cannot know what God is, but only what God is not." The great Muslim thinkers of the Kalam tradition made the same affirmation. The paradox is that while God remains at the center of human life, revealing, active, and governing all, God is still a mystery far beyond our human comprehension. Even though we Christians and Muslims read our sacred books, study the various aspects of our religious traditions, and try to live in accord with what is taught therein, God is still able to surprise us and move us forward by His own free activity and power. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Linda Espinosa. Thank you very much for your attention.